Right. So, as I was saying before, welcome to the IHR Transport and Mobility History Seminar. My name is Lewis. I'm a research officer at the University of Essex and a convener of the IHR Transport and Mobility History Seminar team. We've got a number of talks coming up over the next few months. So on the 11th of May, which isn't that far away, they've got quite a few in succession. We have Una Brogan joining us for the alternative modernity of the bicycle in British and French literature, which will be advertised in the chats now. Turning to today's talk, though, we are excited to welcome David Schley, who is an associate professor of history at Hong Kong Baptist University and a visiting researcher in the School of Art, Media and American Studies at the University of East Anglia. He published his first book, Steam City, Railroads, Urban Space and Corporate Capitalism in 19th Century Baltimore, with the University of Chicago Press in 2020. His current book project is titled Gridlocked, A History of Traffic in New York City Before the Automobile. Today, he'll be talking on a similar subject entitled Relieving Broadway, the Politics of Traffic in 19th Century New York City. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Lewis, for the kind introduction. Let me pull my slides up. Okay. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My thanks especially to the conveners of the Transportation and Mobility History Seminar at the IHR for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I should speak for about 45 minutes, and I think that we'll be able to hold the remainder of time for questions. So this talk is drawn from a book project called Gridlocked, A History of Traffic in New York City Before the Automobile. Gridlocked draws on insights from the field of mobility studies to write an urban history centered on movement and efforts to regulate movement. It focuses on the period between 1811, which marked the start of Manhattan's grid plan, and 1897, when New York's Common Council enacted the first comprehensive traffic ordinance in the United States. The 8+ decades between these events saw New York's population expand 35 times over, from less than 100,000 people in 1810 to nearly 3.5 million people in 1900. This growth, coupled with New York's increasing role as a global hub for manufacturing and trade, drew unprecedented numbers of people, vehicles, and animals into New York streets. As traffic congestion intensified in the 19th century, traffic management, which I define broadly as the regulation of mobility in the streets, became a central object of urban governance. Efforts to control traffic shaped the governing institutions and the social life of the city. The New York Police Department created an entire division to manage traffic on Broadway. Engineers held conferences to discuss the problem of what they called urban locomotion, and proposals for things like one-way streets, elevated railways, and pedestrian bridges became fixtures of the local press and of city politics. And yet traffic proved difficult to control. Contemporary reports indicate that traffic intensified in New York decade upon decade as the limits of dense settlement stretched further up Manhattan Island. Only in the 20th century, with the rise of the automobile and the urban planning profession, would a set of standardized systems take hold in the streets. Yet I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the traffic reforms of the 19th century as failed experiments, or to see traffic congestion itself as merely a byproduct of urban growth. Rather, I believe that we can situate 19th century urban traffic control within a broader set of efforts by state authorities and capitalists to control mobility in an era marked by unstable boundaries and novel forms of communication. In making this claim, I take a page from scholars of empire and capitalism who have drawn attention over the past decade to the ways in which, in the 19th century, new patterns of movement, both forced and voluntary, bound distant places together in new ways. New Yorkers' efforts to ameliorate traffic conditions coincided with a period marked by mass migrations across vast distances, a period in which famine and enclosure in Europe sent hundreds of thousands of people en route to the Americas, a period in which federal troops drove native peoples off of their lands in the southern US, clearing the way for the cultivation of cotton by enslaved people, a period in which abolition in the British colonies prompted the revival of indentured servitude and the movement of people from southern China and South Asia to the Caribbean. Managing this churning movement was a major project, manifest in things like vagrancy laws and immigration exclusion acts and contract labor regimes. It's set against this backdrop that I think we might be able to start to see efforts to regulate traffic in New York in a new light. My point is not to suggest an equivalence. The politicians, engineers, capitalists, and newspaper editors who were trying to address New York's traffic problems were not channeling movement across vast distances like a colonial administrator in London or a labor recruiter in Hong Kong. Rather, what I want to suggest is that changing currents of global travel inflected efforts to manage traffic in cities like New York. This is because city streets were, after all, critical infrastructure for global capitalism in this period. The journey of a cotton ball from the hands of an enslaved person in Alabama to the hands of a child laborer in Lancashire, more often than not involved transit through the streets of New York. And when traffic in those streets came to a halt, it underscored the fragility of the system as a whole. In fact, as I was writing this, I found myself thinking a little bit about the ship that ran aground in the Suez Canal back in 2021 as a similar sort of choke point in these broader networks of trade and communications. Easing traffic congestion was an urban project, but it was one that carried implications beyond the city limits. Most efforts to unclog the streets of 19th century New York failed in the face of political infighting, inadequate resources, and limited imagination. Yet even unsuccessful efforts to control traffic shaped New Yorkers' experience of the city. Technologies and regulations that sought to foster circulation within urban space did so by curtailing or sometimes criminalizing movement along class, gender, ethnic, and racial lines. Questions about how to manage New York's traffic were at heart debates over whose mobility should be privileged and whose should be curtailed. Now, the material for today's talk comes from a chapter in Gridlocked, part of the larger project, that focuses on a multi-decade campaign to ease congestion in New York's most important thoroughfare, Broadway. This is, I will note, the first time that I've had the opportunity to share this material with a public audience, which makes me particularly eager to solicit your comments, questions, and suggestions, as this is a moment, sort of an inflection point for this chapter and for the project as a whole, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm going to start by explaining how and why the relief of Broadway, as they called it, became a recurring motif in the politics of New York City and New York State. I will then delve into the reasons why 19th century Broadway was so crowded in the first place. Next, I will talk about the origins of Broadway relief as a political topic, including New Yorkers' engagement with the urbanists of London and Paris, and the conceptual frameworks that they brought to traffic planning. Finally, I will offer a brief survey on the methods that New Yorkers tried to use to address congestion in Broadway, closing with the discussion of the street railroad project. I aim to show how in this time, in this place, control of mobility became a central object of urban governance, even as efforts to realize that control proved halting and partial. It is likely that few spots in the 19th century world were as prone to traffic jams as New York's Broadway. Even visitors from traffic-addled cities like London were taken aback by the volume of people and vehicles they encountered in New York's preeminent street. The travel writer Isabella Lucy Bird, writing in 1856, declared, "Pack the traffic of the Strand and Cheapside into Oxford Street, and still you will not have an idea of the crush on Broadway. A journey from one end to the other of this marvelous street is a work of time and difficulty." Many, of course, attempted this journey nonetheless. Tourists, promenaders, commuters, and cartmen all took to Broadway. Broadway was at once a cultural landmark and a vital thoroughfare, and many commentators saw its traffic as evidence of New York's dynamism and diversity. Charles Dickens, for one, in American Notes, structures his engagement with New York as a series of trips up and across Broadway. It's the spine that structures his travels through New York's neighborhoods and institutions. As an 1869 guidebook put it, Broadway is New York intensified, hustling, feverish, crowded, ever-changing. By mid-century, though, a growing number of observers worried that Broadway was becoming a glorified parking lot. This is the New York Times. Each month and each week beholds the accession of new crowds and business to those which already choke Broadway to suffocation. You may perceive the increase day by day. You are more jostled today than yesterday. Tomorrow will come nearer being run over than you came today. And what quantitative surveys we have largely sustain this impression. In one study in 1852 counted 15,815 vehicles rolling past the foot of City Hall Park, which is in downtown New York on Broadway, over a 13-hour period. At the busiest travel times, some 20 to 24 vehicles per minute passed by. And the increasing volume of traffic slowed the pace of travel. In 1853, one transit user reported that he sat in an omnibus for 35 minutes to go 7 blocks, which, if you run the numbers through a map, works out to an average speed of less than 2 miles per hour. As the editors of the Times concluded, Broadway demands relief. For a half century, from the 1830s through the 1880s, the relief of Broadway was a major project in New York City. Hundreds of proposals received a public hearing in these years. Would-be traffic engineers from as far away as South Carolina set their minds to the relief of Broadway. Most of the proposals that were submitted stuck to a limited menu of solutions: street openings, traffic regulations, and transit initiatives like horse-drawn railroads. City and state officials argued over these proposals with an intensity that might surprise even seasoned veterans of urban politics. A reporter for the Herald described one such proposal for the relief of Broadway as the great, throbbing and absorbing topic of legislation at the present time, a claim that sounds for all the world like ordinary 19th century newspaper hyperbole until you notice the dateline. March 15th, 1861, at the height of a secession crisis that would imminently precipitate civil war. In short, as the rest of the country was preparing for battle, the legislators in Albany were talking about traffic in Broadway. The relief of Broadway traffic was by no means a strictly local concern. Debates about how to relieve Broadway were part of a transnational conversation around urban traffic control. New Yorkers looked primarily to London and Paris, cities that also experienced stifling congestion in the 19th century. Solutions developed in one city quickly entered the policy debates of the others. Historians and geographers have shown that in the 19th century, urban reformers sought to cast the multivalent street as a space of transit, pushing other uses, hawking, socializing, cleaning laundry, either indoors or in some cases outlawing them altogether. In doing so, such urban reformers helped create the modern networked metropolis and work to regulate the activities of subject populations. Broadway traffic amelioration efforts largely track with these findings. Examining the decades-long efforts to relieve Broadway shows how control of mobility became a major political project. But it also shows, in this context at least, just how challenging this project could be to achieve. New York's geography and attention to it might help explain why this topic aroused such interest and why it proved so difficult to control. New York City, which for the period under consideration here, for the most part, was coterminous with the island of Manhattan, sits at the point where the Hudson River empties into the Atlantic Ocean. By the middle of the 19th century, New York City, or well, by 1860 anyway, New York City was the clearinghouse for a majority of US foreign trade. Its commercial networks went by water and rail north to the population centers of New England, west to the free labor breadbasket of the Great Lakes, south to the slave labor cotton fields and sugar islands of the US South and Caribbean, and east to the industrial hubs of Europe, including particularly Britain. Much of this vast trade converged on a U-shaped 3-mile stretch of Manhattan shoreline from Canal Street on the Hudson River to Catherine Street on the East River. It was here that the congestion in New York streets began, not on land, but on water. Ocean-going steamers competed with one another to get a berth, and when they finally did, they landed at points and struggled to unload their cargo. On the west side, you'd get steamers headed across the Atlantic. On the east side, canal boats and cotton ships. Immigrants often landed, at least from 1855 on, at the southern tip of the island, and every part of this U contained commuter ferries that were running every day and inspiring Walt Whitman's poetry. The convergence of these varied trades and varied travelers made the waterfront a notoriously hectic scene. Hacks, omnibuses, carts, wagons clustered on shore, clamoring for customers and waiting to transport goods and people to their next destination, which often lay miles away from the port itself. When these vehicles pulled away from the wharves, most of them converged on a single street, Broadway. North-south traffic took to Broadway for perhaps obvious reasons because it offered the only continuous path between the city's extremities. It linked downtown New York's shipping and commercial institutions with the residential developments and railroad depots of Midtown Manhattan. East-west traffic also engaged with Broadway. Of course, if with the road running through the middle of the city, they had to cross it to get from side to side. But many vehicles, especially in lower Manhattan, also entered into Broadway for at least a portion of their journey. As a largely disarticulated street system in the lower part of Manhattan led to few direct routes or few straight shots between the two rivers. And you can sort of see this on the map that I've provided here, the ways in which the roads going to the East River, roads going to the Hudson or North River don't always align. And even where they might seem to align, they're often at a slightly different angle that creates difficulties for navigation. When these streams of travel merged, traffic could easily come to a halt, something that was nowhere more evident than at the intersection of Broadway and Fulton Street. Fulton was one of the few streets in lower Manhattan that offered a direct path between the rivers, which made it a favorite route for cartmen. Fulton Street was also anchored at either end, both with important ferries and major food markets, all of which generated significant traffic in their own right. The result was that Fulton's intersection with Broadway, the point where, in the words of one person, where Fulton Street debouches into Broadway, became, as a correspondent to the Tribune put it in 1857, the tough central knot of the gigantic convolution that was New York traffic. And I am going to read this list out, and I'll explain why in a moment. The center, Fulton and Broadway, is the center of this chaotic intertwisting of wheels, horses, Italian imagemen, drivers, whips, organ grinders, dogs, droves of cattle, crinoline, policemen, monkeys, Leary's hats, moire antique peanut stands, liveries, and mud. Even a minor accident at this junction could induce a jam that froze traffic for a mile or more. The Sisyphean task of untangling these jams fell to the police, at least from the 1840s on, who waded into the fray and physically dislodged the vehicles, pulling apart the interlocked wheels and directing drivers to move on, at which point the police could retreat to the intersection and wait for another set of vehicles to become entangled so they could start the process again. As traffic jams grew more frequent in the back half of the 19th century, stories about them, about the jams themselves, became a distinct genre of newspaper reportage. One convention of this genre was the list of the various entities stuck in place, as in the Tribune article that's on the screen now. Journalists reveled in the juxtapositions that these lists exposed. Traffic jams, they seem to imply, had the power to level social distinctions, at least for a time, fusing the country wagon and the liveried carriage alike into a single immovable lump. Some observers took this a little bit further, arguing that the jam offered a unique window into the workings of global capitalism. The writer Richard Harding Davis, near the end of the 19th century, identified congestion on Broadway as, in his words, a trade parade. He wrote, "Carts loaded with boxes of unmade clothing, lock wheels with drays carrying unmade food, and the express wagons, with their precious loads of silver bullion, are crowded by drays carrying great haunches of raw meat to the transatlantic steamers." Davis called the vehicles mashed together at Broadway the ammunition trains of the great army of workers, a temporary convergence of raw materials and capital that were part of a shared process, but were rarely outside of this street in these moments actually seen together. In one sense, of course, this traffic reflected New York's important place in the global economy. A municipal committee referred to them as a plethora, referred to traffic as a plethora of progress, or excuse me, no, a plethora of prosperity. But traffic jams also showcased the inherent fragility of New York's commercial networks and provisioning infrastructure. Commuters missed ferries, travelers missed trains, shipments missed steamers because they were stuck in traffic. Shipping merchants claimed that traffic delays cost them upwards of $100,000 a day. If unrelieved, they argued, a crisis born of growth would induce urban decline. A reporter for the London Times, who took note of New York's gridlock in 1856, summed up the situation like this: "There's a perpetual jam and lock of vehicles for nearly 2 miles along the chief thoroughfare. The traffic is outgrowing the capacity of the streets to admit it. And as the busiest part of the city is also the narrowest, with the sea on both sides of it, it is a puzzle to devise any plan to relieve the pressure." It had not always been this way, of course. As far as I can tell, the relief of Broadway first entered New Yorkers' political vocabulary on or about September 27th of 1832. That day, the Evening Post, a newspaper, published a letter from a correspondent who, in discussing a street opening that had been bandied about, mentioned, and I'll quote, "It was avowed that one of the objects sought to be attained was to relieve Broadway." Now, it's possible that this phrase or other permutations of it appeared earlier than this and have eluded newspaper databases, optical character recognition software. But what is certain is that from this point, relief of Broadway became a major political project in New York City and New York State. Broadway had long been the city's principal thoroughfare from the earliest days of colonial settlement, back when New York was New Amsterdam and Broadway was, and I don't actually know the pronunciation, but I think it's de Breadweg. It is also commonly asserted and likely true that this street originated as a road used by the indigenous Lenape, who lived in Manhattan before the Dutch arrived. The sights and sounds of Broadway drew a steady crowd to its sidewalks from the late 18th century on, and its breadth made it a preferred avenue for cartmen. The traffic of Broadway was, for many observers, integral to its charm. "Broadway is crowded simply because it is Broadway," wrote a correspondent to the Evening Post in 1833. "There is more to interest, more to see, hear, observe, and remark upon in that street than in any other in the city." Even as the Post published these remarks, a growing number of New Yorkers were arguing that Broadway had become too crowded. Pedestrians were the first to complain. Increasing traffic, they said, had made crossing Broadway an exercise in mortal peril, forcing pedestrians to dodge speeding vehicles as if they were players in a high-stakes game of Frogger. An 1837 guidebook informed readers that to cross Broadway safely, you must button your coat tight about you, see that your shoes are secure at the heels, settle your hat firmly on your head, look up street, down street, and at the selfsame moment to see what carts and carriages are upon you, and then run for your life. In time, some New Yorkers made it a point of pride that they could make it across the street safely. They took it as a reflection of their urban savvy and know-how. One local politician in a oft-repeated quote, I've never found the original form of this, but it's circulated widely, is supposed to have said that it takes more brains to cross Broadway than it does to live one's life in a country village. And actually, I'll note just as an aside that as I was preparing for this, I briefly contemplated including that famous line from Midnight Cowboy in which Dustin Hoffman almost gets hit by a cab and says, hey, I'm walking here. An attitude that surely had 19th century precursors. One more very quick aside on that. I didn't realize until I found the clip that Hoffman immediately then says, getting hit by a car can be good for insurance, which is also a joke that circulated in the 19th century. In any case, though, most New Yorkers, including those who were able to cross the street with ease, felt that the situation called for some form of relief. Now, the causes of this apparent uptick in traffic in the 1830s were multifaceted. New York was, by this point, the fastest growing city in the United States, and at some point in the 1830s, it overtook Mexico City as the largest city in the Americas. And this prodigious growth coincided with a period of commercial expansion. By the 1830s, the Erie Canal was fully open. Atlantic packet ships had been running between London, New York and Liverpool for over a decade. And Southern cotton production, grown by enslaved laborers in the Deep South, was in full swing. All of this was feeding into the growth of New York's economy and its built environment, and all of which introduced more traffic and more vehicles into the city streets. The discovery of traffic problems in Broadway served in some ways as a kind of milestone for the city. Officials in London and Paris had grappled with street traffic for centuries. Ancient Rome famously had its own traffic regulations. And to claim in the 1830s that Broadway needed relief was in a sense to put New York on a level with those cities. New Yorkers looked to London and to Paris for guidance on traffic questions, and both the language and the remedies of European traffic control inflected the conversation in Manhattan. Londoners and Parisians often used the metaphor of circulation to describe urban traffic, a conceit that was rooted in understandings of the human circulatory system that took hold in the 17th century and was reaffirmed when Adam Smith also took up the metaphor of circulation to describe the movement of capital in a capitalist economy. The analogy of circulation cast streets as arteries within an urban body and represented vehicular traffic as a sort of lifeblood. The circulation metaphor suggested that if streets were obstructed, neighborhoods would succumb to urban gangrene and would decay. Urbanists in London and Paris took circulation as their watchword, justifying new streets and traffic regulations as ways to clear obstructions and to foster healthy movement. These coronary metaphors certainly made their way into New York as well. You find them in government reports, you find them in press reporting. Writers in New York often described traffic jams as aneurysms, which suggests the flow of traffic, bursting against the sides of the street. And one term that they commonly used, congestion, has so thoroughly entered the modern vocabulary of street traffic that its roots in medical pathology are easily forgotten, as Brian Ladd's pointed out in his book on European streets. And yet there was another analogy that dominated New Yorkers' descriptions of traffic: the flow of water. Writers invoked Broadway's restless current, its living tide. They spoke of the human freshet overflowing the bounds. Walt Whitman described Broadway as an ever-flowing land river, and the editors of the Evening Post compared the convergence of the immense currents of one intersection to, in their words, the meeting of the tides at Hellgate, which was a notoriously hazardous strait just northeast of Manhattan. Now, I don't mean to suggest that water metaphors were unusual as applied to vehicular traffic. That's not the case, and that, if anything, they became more so in the decades to follow. But New Yorkers deployed the language of water constantly, and they did so with local points of reference. Manhattan is surrounded on all sides by tidal waters, and they invoke the flow of these waters to make sense of urban traffic's temporal dimensions. Tidal analogies reflected the fact that traffic was not steady like a heartbeat, but that it instead varied according to daily and seasonal rhythms. Like the East River, Traffic on Broadway changed course frequently, moving downtown in the morning and uptown at night. Like the Hudson River, Broadway was harder to navigate in the winter and in the spring when pathways iced up or thawed into muck. Water metaphors cast traffic abatement measures as a sort of human hydrology, a way of rendering the daily and seasonal tides of traffic manageable, and a way as well of preparing the city for future growth. Much as urban planners in the 21st century ponder how to keep floodwaters induced by climate change at bay, their 19th century precursors worried that the rising tides of traffic would in time make the city unlivable. And I won't be talking about it today, but also in the larger chapter, I discussed the traffic problems in Broadway as a housing crisis as linked to the unaffordability of New York housing. City officials hoped that opening new streets, building new transit lines would ward off the periodic excesses of travel that brought movement in the city to a halt. And yet controlling the flow of water and controlling the flow of traffic were very different propositions. Tidal metaphors cast traffic as an agentless process, its flow governed by natural laws, but people and vehicles would not be as easily channeled as drops of water. Efforts to relieve Broadway turned not on questions of technological feasibility, or not principally on questions of technological feasibility, but on questions about who would control the street, which people or vehicles would be accorded priority, and who would benefit from the solutions proposed. The relief of Broadway was often discussed as an engineering problem, but it was really a political problem. Efforts to control who could use the street were bound to be controversial. Plans for relief of Broadway took three basic forms, with lots of variations among them: street openings, traffic policing, and transit projects. Conversations about how to effect these plans led to a broader discussion about the ends of urban government and questions in some quarters about the practical limits of urban democracy. The first of these initiatives, street openings, sought to alleviate Broadway's congestion by furnishing alternative channels for heavy traffic. A 20th century New Yorker, Robert Moses, famously observed that to open motorways in a dense city, and I'll quote Moses from Caro's biography here, you have to hack your way through with a meat axe. And this was no less true in the 19th century. Then, as in Moses's time, some saw the destruction that inevitably accompanied street opening as a net positive, a way to evict dense concentrations of people that they deemed undesirable. To give just one example, proponents of widening one street, which was put forward as a plan to relieve Broadway, argued that doing so would allow for, quote, the removal of the shanties used as Jewish clothing stores. But unlike under Moses's administration or Moses's reign, street openings in the 19th century moved forward very slowly. For starters, abutting property owners objected to the taxes incurred in street widenings, and city officials proved remarkably sensitive to the needs of pedestrians. They blanched at plans that involved sacrificing sidewalk space for vehicular travel. Moreover, 19th century critics of street openings understood what highway planners sometimes still struggle to grasp today, that opening new streets might increase capacity, but it would not reduce traffic. When streets did open, something that happened usually after decades of delay, they quickly became just as clogged as Broadway. Others hoped that the solution to Broadway's overcrowding could be found in more effective regulation of vehicular traffic. New York's police force was, from its origins, tasked with enforcing speed limits and right-hand driving laws. And there's a fuller discussion of policing and the NYPD in the larger project, which is the subject of a chapter. Many proposals for the relief of Broadway involve putting the police to work. A specialized branch of the NYPD called the Broadway Squad, founded in 1860, had as its mandate to help people cross the street, to clear obstructions, and to unstick traffic jams. This image is a little late for my period, but nonetheless gives you a sense of how at least some New Yorkers felt about their efforts. But rigid traffic enforcement often came with heavy class biases. Many who called for regulating traffic in New York envisioned this, for Broadway, envisioned it as a channel for omnibuses and carriages, And mayors sent police to chase down what the Herald called villainously democratic vehicles like butcher's carts or milk wagons that dared to show themselves in Broadway. Others thought that police could serve as agents capable of enforcing one-way street laws or implementing a gas-powered streetlight, which was itself based on a model devised and briefly used in London in 1869, but neither of these proposals actually came to a pass. I think that the most famous Broadway relief measure, at least the one that shows up in the most secondary sources, was a quick fix that they tried to implement in the 1860s, a pedestrian bridge based on models used in Paris that went up at the intersection of Broadway and Fulton in 1867. When the bridge went up, the New York Times envisioned it as the first of a series of pedestrian walkways and said that Londoners were watching the New York experiment with and contemplating a similar improvement of their own. But public opinion on the bridge quickly soured. New Yorkers complained that the bridge was too steep, that it was encrusted with filth, and worst of all, that it was overrun with tourists who, instead of using it to get from one side of the street to the other, would perch on it for, if reports are to be believed, hours watching the traffic flow underneath. Ultimately, the state Supreme Court condemned the Broadway Bridge as a public nuisance, and it was taken down in 1868. Much of the blame for the failure of these initiatives and for the continued congestion in Broadway fell on New York's government, and the city government in particular. Middle-class New Yorkers complained that immigrant voters sent corrupt men to City Hall, men who lined their pockets instead of serving the public good. Yet the city's poor record on traffic relief, and for that matter, the poor record of the state government, which took up the issue in the late 1850s and 1860s, reflected the complexity of the problem and the competing interests at play. Transit improvements theoretically stood to benefit the whole city, and yet each proposal also pitted different groups against one another. Such conflicts led some New Yorkers to argue that traffic problems effectively lay beyond the capabilities of democratic governance. The editors of the New York Times, about as solidly middle-class a publication as you can find, surveyed the conditions of the city's streets in 1873 and were dismayed by what they found. The street travel of New York has become so intricate as well as so great that its management can no longer be safely left to chance and to the mutual accommodation of drivers and passengers, or to public officers who are burdened with other duties. Our street travel sooner or later must be organized and placed under the control of one capable and experienced officer whose immediate power should be almost autocratic and his responsibility commensurate with the importance of his functions. These comments coming in 1873 reflected a broader disaffection among white, middle and upper class Americans with democratic politics that took hold in the late 1860s and 1870s. To people with such a mindset, New York's seemingly unsolvable traffic problems offered an object lesson in the need for a firm technocratic hand in municipal affairs. And indeed, the late 1860s saw the creation of a number of metropolitan governing bodies that orchestrated city building at a remove from New York's working class immigrant electorate. These included parks commissions, West Side development commissions, metropolitan police, health boards. The parks commissioner, someone by the name of Andrew Haswell Green, has among his more famous quotes that the law of the street is motion, not rest. And I'm no longer quoting him now, the police should be able to arrest anybody who lingers or loiters in the street. But when voters put city Democrats back in charge in the early 1870s, middle-class reformers lost hope that a traffic czar was in the offing. They looked instead with a mixture of envy and resignation to Paris, where Baron Haussmann had torn up the old city to make way for the new. As the editors of the Tribune put it, when we have a Louis Napoleon, we may make a Paris. When the sky falls, we may catch larks. It's also worth noting that from the beginning, there was a countercurrent in public conversation around relief of Broadway that insisted that the street did not require relief at all. Some of this was the product of a liberal fear of government overreach. If Broadway was really too crowded, the argument went, traffic would in time, like a self-correcting market, retreat into other channels, or perhaps to other cities. Others advance an argument worthy of Robert Moses's one-time rival, Jane Jacobs, that crowding and chaos came with advantages in their own right. The street, they contended, served not only the needs of transportation, but as a place to socialize, to lounge, to see, and to be seen, and relieving Broadway of its crowds would sacrifice these functions. The most spirited argument in this vein came in 1852 from a public meeting discussing Broadway relief efforts. I won't read the entire thing, but I'll skip down to this line, which is within the small circuit of New York traffic enthusiasts, a famous line. This din, this driving, this omnibus thunder, this squeezing, this jamming, crowding, and at times smashing is the exhilarating music which charms the multitude and draws its thousands within the world. This is Broadway. This makes Broadway. Take it from it these elements, the charm is gone, and it is no longer Broadway. The citizens who lodged their brief for omnibus thunder did so in opposition to what was perhaps the most fervently debated solution to Broadway's traffic woes, a horse-drawn railroad. I will conclude today's talk by discussing the fate of the Broadway Railroad, a venture that illustrates both the competing interests and the complicated politics of urban traffic reform. The debate over whether or not to build a railroad in Broadway began in earnest in the 1850s. During that decade, an economic and population boom drove the limits of dense settlement well up the island of Manhattan, making transit increasingly a priority. In 1852, many of the city's north-south avenues received horse car franchises. Broadway did not, but some argued that this was precisely what Broadway needed. The loudest voices, of course, were people who wanted a franchise for themselves, seeing the tremendous profits that were latent in a Broadway line, and who sought a franchise aggressively. But many people who did not stand to profit directly also endorsed the project of a Broadway railroad. A railroad in Broadway, horse-drawn, I should note, would allow for fast communication between the downtown commercial district and the residential settlements further up Manhattan, would, they said, boost property values, ease commutes, and would serve as a trunk line for the city's horse car system as a whole, taking these disconnected lines and knitting them together. A side benefit that they pointed out was that railroad tracks, because they jutted up from the pavement, would force vehicles to align themselves into orderly patterns, preventing carts and omnibuses from swerving around as they saw fit. With a track in place, they couldn't make sharp turns, or they couldn't make acute turns. They would have to cross at 90-degree angles, and they would have to line up on the right side of the road. Some began to see a horse car line in Broadway as a technological upgrade for the railroad age. The prospect of a railroad in Broadway proved uniquely controversial, however. Proponents of a railroad in Broadway, including New York's famous boss, William Tweed, argued that opposition came principally from well-heeled carriage drivers and from landlords. And he had a point. Perhaps the most common argument against a railroad in Broadway was that property owners who owned property fronting the street should have a deciding vote on the fate of the street, regardless of what the masses of voters desired. Two people who made such an argument, including the wealthy traffic reformer Charles Astor Bristed, placing tracks in Broadway was a kind of defilement. Bristed argued particularly that if New York was to overtake Paris as the metropolis of the Western Hemisphere, something that he believed would happen once Union forces prevailed in the Civil War, it would need to have a showpiece street like Broadway that was unencumbered by rails. Joining Bristed and other wealthy property owners in this campaign were truck and cart drivers who opposed a railroad in Broadway for a different set of reasons. Maneuvering through the narrow, winding streets of Lower Manhattan required drivers to make subtle turns. As one engineer put it, wagon teams navigating Broadway had to learn how to, quote, flow more like liquids than like solids. It was only by making subtle adjustments to right-of-way that drivers managed to keep traffic in motion. And it was a skill that they developed over years and years of practice with their horses. Rail tracks would make such forms of street navigation all but impossible. One truck driver pleaded to the city to retain Broadway as a highway for truck horses, pointing out that the delays he would encounter from rail traffic and from the rails themselves would make him stuck in place and would cause him to miss deliveries. For more than 30 years, anti-railroad forces kept tracks out of Broadway. In 1884, however, as Lower Broadway became increasingly business-oriented, and as new railroad incorporation laws made it easier to secure a franchise, a man by the name of Jacob Sharp secured permission from the city government to build a horse car line on the street. It later transpired that Sharp had given 20 out of 24 of the city aldermen $20,000 each for the privilege. And when these revelations surfaced, a number of aldermen were imprisoned and others went into exile in Canada. Sharp, for his part, was also arrested and languished in jail awaiting retrial until he died in 1888. But the railroad that he franchised remained, and for a time, it gave the street, by most accounts, a measure of relief. There were wagon accidents, there were stuck cars, and yet traffic jams in Broadway, if newspaper reporting is any guide, became incidental rather than endemic. Newspapers referred to the traffic jams when they occurred as old-fashioned blockades, suggesting they were sort of remnants of the past. But by then, the conversation had moved on. By the 1880s, urban authorities increasingly realized that they could not relieve Broadway in isolation, and the project of Broadway relief gave way to a more systematic approach to a systematic problem. The stage was set, in other words, for the traffic engineers of the 20th century. I opened this talk by invoking the transcontinental circuits that set hundreds of thousands of people in motion in the first era of mass migration, and I've closed it by talking about a streetcar in Broadway. I'm aware that these topics sound quite distinct, and they are quite distinct. I don't mean to draw an equivalence between them. I do hope, however, that writing an urban history through the lens of mobility can help us break down some of the distinctions between the global and the local. Mobility underscores the artifice of geographic scale by showing how people move or do not move across jurisdictions and showing the effect that those jurisdictions has on their movement. Examining the multi-decade efforts to relieve Broadway shows how, in a world shaped by new patterns of movement, control of mobility in the city emerged as a major political project, even as it shows just how difficult something as protean as mobility can be to control. On that note, I will conclude. Thank you so much for coming out here and listening. And